So hello. Today I'm going to be talking about how exam access works when you're not part of the standard school system, some of the challenges of that and what the opportunities are too. I'll mostly be coming from the point of view of home educators here, but there is also a fair amount of overlap with a variety of alternative provision settings and with adult learners. I'm also going to focus on the GCSE stage. Plenty of home educators do continue to study for A-levels at home, and some even opt for a completely alternative route, such as a US transcript and SATs. But it's most common to tackle some GCSEs at home and then move into post-16 settings. And that's what I'll cover here. Firstly, who am I and how do I know this stuff? I'm a long-term home educator. None of my 4 children have ever been to school before sixth form. In the last 6 years, I've organised 16 GCSEs, covering 14 different specs, for 3 of my children, using 3 different exam centres. And I'm expecting to have another 5 years to go. But outside of that personal experience, I'm also heavily involved in local and national peer support groups, which gives me an overview of the wide range of experiences that families encounter. And I'm a trustee of the Home Educators Qualifications Association, which provides a bridge between home educators and formal organisations like Ofqual and the exam boards. It is important to say, I'm not speaking here today on behalf of any of those groups. This is just me, but I am drawing on that breadth of experience. And when I'm talking about statistics and trends, I'm also drawing on surveys that I've run, from university research and from various Ofqual and exam board statistics. However, I have to caveat that there is no comprehensive set of statistics showing, say, all the entries and results that home-educated children have received at GCSE level. You'll probably realise how difficult that would be as we go through, but I'm more than happy to have a follow-up discussion around that later if anyone wants to. Okay, so the plan is I'll give a quick overview of the basic process, then we'll look in a bit more detail at the opportunities and challenges at each stage. And finally, I'll look towards some changes that may happen in the near future. So, how do home educators access exams? In theory, it's quite a straightforward process. Between you, you decide what subjects and specifications they're going to take and when. They study the content, and meanwhile, you find and book an exam centre that accepts private candidates for that spec and sitting. When exam time comes around, they show up at the exam centre, sit the exam papers, and a couple of months later you get the results. Job done. Now, the rub is that each of these stages has a massive set of choices, variability and constraints to navigate through. It's often very dependent on individual circumstances, budget and local availability, and the different possibilities will overlap and affect each other. There's no definitive source to go to for answers, and everyone you ask will have had a different experience and different opinions, so it can be hard to figure out what's best in your particular case. It's a lot to get your head around. With great freedom comes great responsibility. So let's look at each of those stages in a bit more detail, starting with what goes into choosing subjects, boards and timings. First up, subject choice. For a home educator, the world is your oyster. There are no rules, no set legal requirement to sit any particular subjects, or to cover a broad range, or take any number of subjects, unlike the pretty tight constraints on a pupil in school. You also have, in theory, the full range of subjects and boards to choose from, including international GCSEs. And it is important to bear in mind the range of reasons that bring people to home education. A high proportion of home-educated children have some form of SEND or mental health needs, particularly so the later they deregister from school. So while high academic achievement is absolutely the focus for some home educators, for many it just isn't the priority. However, you're still subject to the same onward entry requirements as everyone else. That's another thing that can vary massively depending on an individual's likely path and on the local landscape, particularly at post-16. But for the majority of home educators, at least some GCSEs will be required at some point, with maths and English language at the top of the list. I won't cover them in this talk, but as an aside, there is a significant minority who opt for functional skills instead of GCSE. So, the big opportunity here is being able to personalise the subjects taken to your child's individual interests, aspirations and needs. The challenge is that actually you don't have quite free rein to choose. A number of GCSEs have a practical component that requires centre verification during the course. That can be for non-exam assessment that actually contributes to the grade, like in PE or art, or it can be a practical requirement that doesn't contribute to the grade but does require an explicit centre sign-off, as in GCSE sciences, geography or computer science. Being outside of the school system makes this much more difficult. How difficult varies. Some subjects have alternatives, like using international GCSEs for science and most of the other practical sign-offs. Some are possible, but only if the student works with a tutor that's affiliated with an exam centre, which significantly increases costs and limits both study and exam centre options. Some are, to all intents and purposes, just not possible. A factor in all subject choices is that you need to find a centre that supports that spec for private candidates. Some boards, like Cambridge International, are no longer funded for state schools, and so the number of centres is more limited. Some subjects are harder for the centre to deal with, like ones involving on-screen exams and speaking components, which can make it much harder to find a centre for. You will always find someone who's been able to do it somewhere, but that doesn't mean you'll have a local affordable option. Generally, though, anything that's based on exam papers only and from one of the main exam boards is going to be the most accessible. So what does this end up looking like? Of course, there is lots of individual variation, but overall, home-educated children will take fewer subjects in total. Most people will have maths and English language in there, and then often they'll just plan on whatever the minimum number of GCSEs is to fit a chosen post-16 route. That can include actively planning to go in with a level 1 or 2 course that doesn't require any prior qualifications. Even where A-levels and university is the aim, it's rare to do more than 8 or 9 subjects, and unusual for it to fit a standard EBAC spread of subject areas. Of course, arts subjects are generally less accessible due to NEA, so people may use alternatives like arts awards, music grades, or portfolio and interview for entry to a post-16 course. English language and maths are the most common subjects to take by far, and there can be significant contention on exam centre places for them. Sciences are usually done separately rather than combined, and then after that there's quite a lot of use of the more unusual subjects that are on offer. My own children have taken astronomy, human biology, psychology and economics, and we've got classical civilizations coming up. Environmental management is another popular choice. There's also a lot of interest in the upcoming natural history GCSE, if the practical requirements end up making it accessible. It's important to note, as you can see at the bottom here, that there is a very high usage of international GCSEs, partly for those specialist subjects, but more often because it's the only way to bypass the practical issues found with GCSEs. In many cases, it isn't a choice, it's a necessity. Now, as with subject choice, outside of a school you're not tied to a set timeline. You don't have to take all your exams in one big chunk at the end of year 11. You can start earlier, run later, and have the option of November sittings for international GCSEs, as well as summer sittings. This gives you the chance to focus in on a smaller set of subjects during each exam season, and to have a few results under your belt when it comes to applying to post-16 options. Again, this is partly a choice and partly a necessity to spread the costs and complexity of private candidate exams. Although there will be pros and cons to this for each individual, there are many challenges here. Some exam centres don't run November exams, particularly Cambridge ones, where the exams often fall into the autumn half-term holiday and timetables can be released late on. But generally, it's just up to you to choose. And here's what that looks like. You can see most candidates are only taking a small number of subjects in each sitting, the majority just 1 or 2, no matter what year they're in. And while most are taking exams in year 10 or 11, there's a decent chunk in year 9 and also in year 12. The key thing here, I think, is that given the choice, very few opt to take all their exams in one go at the end of year 11. Okay, so having planned out the subjects to take and when, what does the process of actually studying look like when it doesn't look like a school? This is really the key point of home education, to be able to personalise study approaches to the individual child, and there are more options available than you probably think. On a broad spectrum, on one side you have something that still looks quite a lot like full-time school, but is maybe delivered online and offers a bit more flexibility over timings and subject choice. So options like King's Interhigh or Minerva, which have a timetable and regular live lessons with a range of teachers covering a range of subjects. On the other side, you have completely family-based independent study, which can be approached in lots of different ways. It could be a parent setting out a timetable to work through a textbook and keeping track of progress. It could be mostly conversational and hands-on, with very little written work until just before exams. It could even be a teenager planning their own timetable and getting through it entirely by themselves. I have to say that last one is very rare, but it does happen. And there's a whole range of options in the middle, where a provider offers resources or a course for an individual subject. This varies from a self-paced package of pre-recorded videos and auto-marked assignments to a tutor who runs timetabled group lessons, either online or in person, including marking homework and giving individual feedback. And there's a whole host of variations in between. And of course there are traditional one-to-one tutors. There are even one-off services like marking an individual past paper. Also, in some areas, local colleges offer a part-time programme, specifically for home-educated teenagers, that teaches some courses at the college for a day or two a week. The courses might be vocational, they might be GCSE. Maths and English language are common ones, of course. What's on offer really varies across the country, if anything is available at all, which isn't a given. However, there is a lot of demand for this, and about 10% of all home-educated 14 to 16-year-olds used one of these programmes last academic year. Now, linked in with the approach to studying is the option to personalise the length of time spent on GCSE content for each subject. If you're using a provider with live lessons, they'll have a fixed timescale, but if you're doing something self-paced, it's up to you. Some will get their heads down, go all in on a subject and cover it in just a few months. Others will meander over a few years. And you can adjust that on the fly. If it doesn't look like they'll be ready when you'd planned, you can just push the exam back to the next sitting. If they're cracking on, you can bring it forward. The only pretty much fixed point is when those exam sittings are available. And the same applies to study approaches. If something isn't working, you can change it up. However, there are challenges too. Cost is a big one, as all home education is self-funded. The more tutor involvement you have, the more it costs. Sometimes there's no option if a subject involves NEA, but usually it's a balance of cost versus a parent's time and knowledge in the case of any particular subject. As a parent, it can be hard to get access to teacher resources. Some past papers and other teaching materials are locked on the exam board websites. The answers for some textbooks aren't available. Resources are usually much more expensive for an individual family than for a school purchase. There are reasons, and there's some workarounds, but it's frustrating. Tutors can also find it hard to access resources without the backup of the school network, and the international GCSEs often just have fewer resources available in the first place. And even if you've got in a very structured course, as the parent, you do need to stay on top of it. Just because there's a login doesn't mean they're using it. Just because there's a textbook doesn't mean they understand it. You need to be aware of whether they're engaging and understanding, and have an overall idea of how on track they are for an exam sitting, which involves being at least somewhere aware of what the requirements for that exam are, even if you're using other resources for the actual teaching. Depending on the particular circumstances of the family, the knowledge and time a parent has, the needs of their child, the support they've found, that can be a significant challenge. Although, it is worth noting, you can have the same challenge for a teenager who's on roll with a school, especially if they're struggling with attendance. And at least while home educating, you're close to what's going on, and you know what they should be doing. However, it can be quite overwhelming considering the sheer number of options available, and the difficulty of knowing what's going to suit your child, how experienced the tutor is, whether it will really cover everything needed for the right spec, and whether that spec works with the exam centre options you have available. As I said at the beginning, this all plays into each other. You might really like a course provider who works to the Cambridge spec, but your local exam centre only does Edexcel. You might decide on a set of options for history that turns out not to have many resources for it. You might deregister your child from school, confident that they're doing really well with their Aqua Triple Science, and you've got a tutor who's been helping them out so far. But then you realise, very late on, that there aren't any centres for GCSE sciences, and everyone else does international GCSE. And everyone you ask for recommendations will say something different. It is absolutely possible. Lots of home educators get their children through exams very successfully, with a great personalised learning experience along the way. And there are really generous, knowledgeable people who've been there, done that, and are ready to share their expertise for free. But I can't lie, it is a lot to deal with, and it isn't easy. Right, so what does studying look like? In terms of pacing, Obviously, the 2-year pace from school is quite natural, but there's a lot of 1-year courses or approaches as well. We've done a mix of both. Some do go through a subject very quickly. I think 6 weeks is the fastest I've heard of, but mostly when I say quickly, I mean 4 to 6 months. At the other end of the scale, some find that after a couple of years, they still need a bit longer. And of course, that's an option. It's very dependent on what knowledge they already have, both of the subject and of exams in general, and just general maturity. You'll tend to find a faster pace is more manageable if they've already got a few good results under their belt. There is probably the most variety in study approaches than in anything, but I would say the majority of families take a mix and match approach depending on the subject, using individual subject courses or group classes for subjects they feel they need most help, and using independent study where they feel most confident. So, for example, my family will tend to just study maths and sciences independently. We use textbooks, practicals, YouTube, past papers, but we'll use an online group class for subjects like English and history, where that peer discussion can really help. Other families might feel happy with humanities, but want to get help in for maths. It's about using your budget and time where it will do most good. There has also been a shift from before COVID, when independent study was more of the norm, to now when there's a greater use of online courses. I think that's partly because of the problems private candidates had over the exam cancellations. It's partly down to a shift in the cohort, with more families deregistering at a later stage. And it's partly a reflection of the increase in options, as the move to online education over COVID introduced everyone else to what we'd been doing all along. You can see that in these 2 survey results. The one on the left is from a research survey carried out by Joe Merritt at the University of Exeter, which shows that before exams were cancelled, the most common study method was self-study. Whereas the right-hand side is a survey carried out in January 21, when it was still very uncertain whether exams would happen or not that year. While quite a few people were still only using independent learning, more now opted for a mixed approach. However, in both cases, using a tutor for all of the GCSE subjects isn't very common. Right, the final stage we'll cover is finding and booking an exam centre so they can actually take the exam. Unfortunately, this is often the most frustrating part of the whole process. So let's see why. So, starting with the opportunities. There are some great, helpful, often well-established centres out there for private candidates. These support a wide range of subjects, deal with access arrangements, and are reasonably priced for what they offer. Some are commercial centres that focus on private candidate exams, some are an add-on to a tutorial service, and some are schools and colleges that open their doors to local home educators despite all the other demands on them. I am enormously grateful to them all, and if you live near one and have the funds to pay for it, it can be a really straightforward experience. However, and you knew that was coming, didn't you? Overall, it's not great. To be honest, I think it's a rapidly approaching crisis, if it isn't already here. We're in a situation where demand is rapidly outstripping supply, with the existing centres struggling to keep up with what they're being asked for, and also a really uneven geographical distribution of centres. This is most noticeable for maths and English, but affects everything pretty much. To give you an idea, there are currently about 160 exam centres accepting private candidates across the UK, and many of those are quite restricted in what they offer. That doesn't sound too bad until you compare it to the 4,000 secondary schools there are in England, or if you happen to live in one of the more rural areas where there's only one slightly precarious centre that covers a 90-minute travel radius. This is getting worse. COVID exam cancellations accelerated an existing drop in the number of centres prepared to take private candidates. At the same time, there's a significant rise in home educators wanting to access them. There's also a greater level of need, both among home educators, so you'd be taking more on, and among schools, so they have less capacity to deal with anything extra. And setting up your own exam centre is rarely an option. There are extensive requirements, including things like a manned term time reception and a dedicated exam storage office. You can't just hire a hall on the day of the exam. Next, the costs for exam fees can be significant, and that's separate to the cost of studying that we've already talked about, which you do at least have some degree of control over. This is just talking about the cost of actually sitting the exam and being awarded a grade for it. With a very few exceptions, there is no funding or support available for home educators for anything, and that includes exam fees. Local authorities rarely even know what options are available in their area, so you really are on your own with this. Those costs vary between centres. It's not just the exam board fee. Sitting an exam involves a lot of other costs as well. Staffing, maintaining premises, equipment, providing access arrangements and assessments, and all of those costs need to be met from somewhere. Roughly speaking, schools are likely to be cheaper as they effectively subsidise those additional costs because they're doing a lot of it anyway. They can charge additional fees to cover it, but some will only ask for individual costs like exam board fees. But commercial centres have to cover everything from the fees they're getting in, plus a bit of profit to make it worth their while, so they can be more expensive. But the flip side of that is that with a school, you are very much an optional extra, whereas a commercial centre should be more responsive and reliable. Now, cost and centre availability are linked. It's not only the actual exam centre fees that you have to pay, particularly if you're in a position where you don't have a local centre. It's also travel and accommodation. If the centre is a couple of hours away, which isn't unusual, that probably means a hotel stay the night before a morning exam, on top of the transport costs to get there. It might mean your partner has to take the day off work to look after your other children, and that can be for 2 or 3 papers per subject. These factors are also a significant contributor to the patterns of home educators taking fewer subjects and spreading them out over more sittings. It also spreads the cost and the complexity of actually sitting the exams. If you need access arrangements, and remember, there is a very high incidence of SEND and mental health concerns among the home-educated population, everything is harder. The process for deciding on what access arrangements are needed for private candidates is difficult to navigate for both families and for centres, and it's expensive before you even get into providing them on the day. These costs shouldn't go directly to the candidate, but someone has to pay them, and there isn't any government support, so the only option is higher fees overall. All this means that even fewer centres can support private candidate access arrangements. So if you need them, your options become more limited and your indirect costs are likely to increase. The key issue behind this is that there is no responsibility for anyone to ensure that exam access is available for home-educated children. So it falls to commercial interests and the kindness of schools and colleges. This leaves you in a vulnerable, precarious position. If you become too much trouble, or something somewhere else becomes more difficult, you are the thing an exam centre doesn't really have to do. When it comes down to it, everyone can just say, "No, sorry, we can't help," and there's nothing you can do. And all of this adds up to yet another deeply complex landscape to navigate. If you're not near one of the big commercial centres, or you can't afford them, the other centres that might take you on chop and change all the time. There's no central booking system, no easy way to know what centre will accept you, for what subjects, at what cost, in a few years down the line when the child will actually be ready to take an exam. It's all a massive, risky unknown. And again, everyone you talk to will have had a different experience and give you a different idea of what you might expect. Now, the more organised parents who've had time to figure it all out, put some money aside, are able to travel and have kids without any particular difficulties, people like me, are going to be fine. Every exam season, thousands of home-educated children do successfully take a wonderful variety of GCSEs, achieve great grades, and move on to their next stages. But it's the families that have had the most difficult journeys so far that find the challenges most difficult to navigate. And that's who I'm concerned about. So, after that tale of woe, what does it actually look like? First up, that scarcity of centres and the implications it has for travel and other indirect costs. Now, this is a relatively small sample, about 250 home-educated candidates from across the country who are sitting exams in summer 22 and 23. But it does very much match what I see reported across the wider networks. You can see that most people are travelling between 20 and 50 miles, with a significant number, about 10%, travelling over 100 miles just to get to an exam centre. I can tell you from experience of our current centre that a 40-mile journey takes a bit over an hour, and it involves a very early start to be sure of making a morning exam fed and ready. If you have a longer journey, then making it that morning isn't really doable. So you see over a quarter of candidates require an overnight stay. That's the thing that really pushes up those indirect costs. In 2021, with the exam cancellations, we used our closest commercial centre, that's 2.5 hours away. 3 subjects, all exam paper only, cost us upwards of £1,500 once you factor everything in. The following year, we used a school an hour's drive away and did twice as many subjects for about a third of the cost. It makes a massive difference to how many subjects you can reasonably take. Now, looking at just the exam fees, this is across 579 GCSE exam entries in summer 22 and 23. Most are falling in the £150 to £200 range. From experience, I'd say that's usually at the higher end, and it's likely to be creeping over the £200 mark as costs have been rising this year. That's balanced out by some cheaper ones, which will be schools just charging costs, but also some that are considerably more expensive. One reason for that is if there's more to an exam than just the exam paper. For instance, doing a language with a speaking component will add about £100 to the cost at a commercial centre. That's what you pay to the exam centre just for sitting the exam there and getting awarded a grade. If you want to do a mock exam at a centre, that'll be a similar amount again. Some will also charge admin fees for things like accessing locked papers or providing copies of exam scripts. And if you do go on to do A-levels from home, you'll be looking at about twice the price for exam papers only. If you're taking A-level science, then the CPAC practical endorsement will cost you an extra £1,000 for each subject. We went for sixth form. Now, on access arrangements. We've talked about the indirect costs of being restricted to a smaller number of centres that might be further away and are more likely to be charging commercial prices. Other than that, though, it's well established that there shouldn't be any extra charges for providing the adjustments. This is quite a small survey. It's the 80 candidates who had access arrangements out of the 250 or so HECA survey responses, but you can see some are still being charged, even for that. It's a bit more of a grey area about whether it's reasonable to charge for the assessment of whether access arrangements are required. This can be quite a complicated and involved process, and at this stage it's not a given that there really is an issue that meets the bar for disability and reasonable adjustments. So, around a quarter of candidates are also facing some charges here. That might be the centre directly charging for the assessment, or it can be a centre saying they can only consider adjustments if there's an external diagnosis suggesting it's needed. We all know what NHS waiting lists are like, so that's typically a private assessment, which is around the £400 range. So hopefully that gives you a glimpse into the world of exams outside of schools, as it looks right now. There are fabulous opportunities to choose exactly the right route for your child, for them to learn the subjects that are right for them, in the way that is right for them, at the time that is right for them. And while it's difficult to compare overall results, home educating through exams is often really successful, including for families on low incomes. This chart shows just a few results from the University of Exeter study, looking at only the study participants where families were eligible for free school meals. And you can see it compares pretty favourably with the average school results. But all those choices are difficult to navigate, and they all come with costs, either in money or in time, which families don't always expect when they leave the school system. Some of that is just what you take on when you opt to home educate, but a lot of it is due to how that infrastructure piece of exam centres works, or, increasingly, doesn't. And from where we are to where we might go. What might be coming down the line for private candidates? Let's have a quick look forwards at a couple of changes on the horizon that might particularly affect home-educated private candidates. One is on-screen exams, both on-screen within a centre and, possibly, allowing for remote invigilation from a candidate's home. There are risks and benefits to this. At a high level, I'd say that home educators are pretty keen on the possibility, but there are quite significant issues to be worked through before exams at home is viable for the general population. Meanwhile, in the short term, on-screen requirements are likely to make centre availability even more difficult for private candidates. So, while long-term I think it's inevitable and probably beneficial, I'm really quite worried about the likely impact over the next few years. There are some wildcard possibilities for on-screen, though. Some of the big barriers to starting an exam centre at the moment are the requirements around secure paper receipt and storage. If everything moves online, maybe pop-up exam centres become more viable. I also think that on-screen at scale is going to require an increase in the number of possible exam sittings, and if that does happen, it's a positive from the home educator point of view. Next, there's currently, and always, lots of talk about possible changes to curriculum and assessment approaches. As we've seen, an increase in NEA, So coursework or teacher-assessed aspects of a subject makes life really hard for home educators. We've seen it in Wales and Scotland, and the net result is we just can't use those qualifications and have to move to either the international or English GCSEs. Now, those conversations are wider than just private candidates, and many home educators would love coursework approaches that they can actually access. But experience leaves me very wary of what could happen here. Finally, support. So far, there is nothing available from state sources for home educators or private candidate exam access more generally. I would love to see a commitment to providing exam centres as a general public facility, just like libraries and swimming pools. I don't think we'll get there anytime soon, but there is a growing awareness within pockets of government that there is a problem here that needs some action. I'm in ongoing talks about that, as are others, but as yet there are no firm policies that would actually help. You might have seen discussion around a children not in school register. That may or may not go anywhere, but even so, while the proposed bill talks about support, it doesn't as yet build anything concrete into law. But I am eternally hopeful, so watch this space. In the meantime, that support falls to other home educators offering voluntary peer support, which luckily is there in abundance once you've found it. There's a general online exams wiki, which is regularly updated by home educators, big and busy Facebook groups, local home educators who have been there and done that, and there's a series of HECA webinars on YouTube covering a range of topics related to home educator exams. That QR code will take you to some useful links. So, if you know any home educators who are trying to navigate this, we're here to help. And that's it from me. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions or want to get in touch, you can find me at any of these places. I'd love to make this whole process just a little bit easier.